I don't know exactly why I do it really. It just developed as a kind of habit to create these doodles in my journals during grad school. And now sometimes during student presentations, which I shouldn't admit that because the students, sometimes they'll be giving a presentation, it'll go on for like a half an hour and they think because I'm doodling something that I'm not paying attention. But
Yes.
yeah, actually I'm very much paying attention when I do that. And that's kind of, I feel as if it creates a separate space for me to be thinking about the real objections to their view instead of just focusing on the surface level kind of structure of what they said. So it's helpful in that regard. Um,
Mm.
but I also find it just to think about the presence of the line. Is it kind of has an allure for me when I'm thinking about my kind of failed attempts, really, because I don't have a background in drawing or art or anything. But when I think about my failed attempts to draw a landscape, I almost feel the line provides its own topology. I don't know if it makes sense, but I don't
Yes, it
exactly know
does.
where one line, how one line is going to start to create a dimension. I just suppose most people are, well, people who obviously know how to draw and art, or they have a better sense of how to develop that than I do. So
Well, I'm not sure that they do because drawing is, I came to drawing very late in my life. And it started out as something very intuitive, a bit of an obsession too. I was a bit obsessive with it.
yeah,
But yeah, so I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was quite surprised to see that actually I was able to reproduce shapes and they they meant something.
yeah,
So I'm not sure that all artists are like that, and I
yeah,
suspect some of them have a perhaps a stronger connection to those dimensions you are mentioning. So whatever they are.
when I think about some of the great artists, if you look at, I mean, I'm not a huge Picasso fan, but if you
Yeah.
do look at the drawings of his or Salvador Dali, there's
Yes.
this sense in which they must have just had the image and then kind of managed to translate it somehow,
Absolutely.
instead of it being more of an ongoing perceptual process of drawing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know Van Gogh's story and
Yes.
his sessions that sort of led him into drawing, and in particular the trouble he had with hands, and even
Mm,
in some of the paintings, the trouble's still there. Really, the hands
yeah.
still, they look kind of gnarled somehow, and they don't look, they have this sort of Michelangelo type gracefulness of a hand.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So fascinating. I think that what's common to Picasso and Dali is the fact that they already mastered classical composition and drawing. And so since they went through it, I mean, completely, and perhaps they came to a point it was simply boring to represent nature like that, they wanted to, that started to make everything more abstract and they sort of exploded the codes of classical representation. And this is the genius behind it. And one of the reasons why, I mean, I am struggling a little bit as an editor in poetry and some other things is that today, I don't know where it comes from. Perhaps it comes from the media. Most poets and artists think that genius is something that you do. I mean, it happens like that. You don't have to work for it, and you can draw abstract shapes now, and you'll be labeled a genius.
right.
And I'm not sure it works that. I think you have to learn the basic elemental laws of drawing and observation also.
Yeah,
Able to
yeah,
observe a lot. So yeah,
yeah. I'd say there's probably unconscious aspects of learning at the very formative stages. So I'm thinking about the role observation would have played in a very different context if you've ever studied some of the chess grandmasters. So chess is an
yes,
area where there's
yes,
also
yes.
prodigy, right?
Yeah.
So if you learn the background of the great Cuban player Raul Capablanca,
Yeah.
it said that when he was just 3 or 4 years old, he would just watch, just silently, patiently watch his
Uh-huh.
father's games.
Uh-huh. Of
And
course.
then, well, something was going on, some kind of
Of
unconscious
course.
learning was going on, so just in terms of pattern recognition. And
Yeah.
then when he finally starts to play, he just crushes everybody. And he has this kind of intuition that he can bring to the game. So that if you were looking at it from the outside, you would just think, wow, this guy must have gone through the Russian school of chess, which is
Yes.
very much more of a principle-based kind of
Yes.
learning system. But it is probably similar for these artists that have kind of they've got the classical training, and it
Mm.
maybe it's kind of a I don't know. It's hard to get away from, in a sense, like the myth of genius. So it's something
Yes.
that just overcomes you, and in a funny way, it can, at the wrong age, it can kind of, I think, encourage this idea that people have these kind of like super talents, that they're just talented at everything. I teach college kids, and they kind of have this
Uh-huh.
too. They just because they write something, really pour their feelings into it, that somehow it's gold. So, and I'm like,
Yes.
well, no.
And no, not yet.
I could tell you sort of a funny story about this, actually. So it
Yeah.
doesn't totally occur at the undergraduate level.
Uh-huh.
It can occur at the grad level too. So I went for an MFA. I did an MFA after my philosophy grad career, and in the MFA program, there was a student who had gotten as far as working on her thesis. So you have to have the
Yes.
thesis. Usually it's like 50 poems. She was doing lyrical poetry.
Yeah.
And I got to talking to her. I said, "Well, okay, what's the topic, right? Is there any kind of unifying theme for your poems?" And she's like, "Yeah, well, I'm writing love poetry." And I said, "Oh, so you must have read a lot of Sappho, right? Or these other?" She had no, I just didn't know who it was. So okay, then just drop everything you're doing and read Sappho,
This is so bizarre. For
right?
me, it's so bizarre that you get to be inspired to write poetry and you're not interested in what other poets have done before
Right, right.
or what they're doing now because oh, this is something very subtle and insidious I have found out is that poets usually they are very interested into their own work. They're interested in their own work. I mean, the contemporary poets, at least the ones I publish, and they're absolutely not interested in the other poets. So I don't know what that is. Is common writer's narcissism or
I think
a
there's a
lack of
degree of
interest?
I think there's a degree of narcissism in it, but also, in a certain sense, a degree of tribalism with it. So if you
Oh,
get passed through an MFA program, and everybody's saying, well, here's the big names, here's the people that you should be reading and that you
yeah,
should
of
be
course.
imitating. Not that they would use that word, but so you get stuck within this sort of coterie of literary figures. And some of them might be contemporary writers, some of them might be writers who write about a very specific set of topics, right?
Yes,
Instead of what I think is a person can actually write about anything whatsoever, and that the book has its own individual demands that it's
yes,
going to make.
yeah,
Yeah, and some of it is just not going through a formative period where you're exposed to a lot of different literary sources. I think it's really important, especially for a young person, to just get off their devices and
mm,
read very widely, right? And read
absolutely.
classics, especially because, after all, it's the classics that have survived. They've been copied in
Yes,
the
yes.
dark
So there
ages,
is something to learn from those
right?
old stuff. Yeah, yeah, of course.
I
Yes.
mean, I dive back into them all the time. Like, I don't know. I try to do a fair amount of writing, obviously, but during the summers, especially, I'll bring a whole bunch of books with me on my travels, and
Mm,
that's a lot
mhm.
of people.
But perhaps it's easier for you because you're a philosopher. So how did you become a philosopher, by the way?
Mm, well, I mean, I think it's probably a long story, and it's hard to know exactly when my interest in philosophy began.
Uh-huh.
My dad happened to have just a lot of books because essentially his job was a book deliverer, for different libraries. So he'd always just be coming home with books that I was reading. Sartre's Nausea when I was 15.
Uh-huh.
It's stuff that I probably shouldn't have been like reading. And I had not so good of a time of it in middle school. I was kind of troubled. I would end up going to, instead of going to the cafeteria, which was just a complete nightmare, I would go to the library, very small school library. And that's where I discovered Aristotle. I'm not a huge Aristotle fan or anything nowadays, but it was a different way of thinking, right? It was a way of just completely prescinding from all the details of the situation and trying to figure out
Yes.
the essences of things.
Yes.
So I didn't know what I wanted to do at all as an undergrad. I was doing anthropology, philosophy. I had my interest in music. When I
Of course.
applied to grad school, it was in 4 different subjects. I just kind of I was encouraged by advisors along the way to study philosophy. So eventually, that's what I chose, and so I went to University of Connecticut.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how, when did the blending with poetry happen? Perhaps it's not visible the moment
Yeah.
you started,
I think probably it had sort of been with me when I started. I mean, I've always been a good sort of journaler. I've always kind of kept journals even since I was 12 or 13. And in grad school, I would usually just try to pursue a topic. And usually I'd be thinking about that topic in images, in through the lens of parable and story, sometimes
Yes.
through poetry. And those journals were not work that I would like really share, or think about publishing in any kind of professional capacity. But they were probably the start of my way of kind of attempting to unify aspects of poetry
Yes.
and philosophy. But then I think, if I had to like choose a year where some of these things started to come together, it'd probably be 2020, when I was on lockdown.
Uh-huh.
And I had read a few different examples of lyric essays, right, which is not something that I really read much of in my grad MFA program. But I'm thinking Anne Carson's The Glass Essay, I found that very interesting. It was personalized, but she was also kind of looking at reading her own experiences through a different text. And I read there was a philosopher called Alfonso Lingus. I happened to just randomly come across one of his books and read it. And he had a very interesting kind of discursive style. And it was plainly not, he is a philosopher, I guess, technically, but he's not so concerned with some of the tiny debates that philosophers sometimes find themselves enmeshed in. So during that time, I was also doing a lot of hiking, and I ended up writing an essay about mountains, right? And so that was really the start of this kind of style, that I've been trying to develop.
It's very interesting because what I loved in your piece, actually, we loved it. I mean, the 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 editorial committee, it's a very touching piece, and but it touches us on many levels, the intellect, the heart, and in the end, you're left with a bittersweet feeling. So it's like, so it's like you travel, you make us travel through various emotions and use ideas also to do that, and anecdotes, and there's such mastery of writing and literature that, yeah, it's been a while I haven't read something so beautiful. So how did you come up? I mean, besides your influential readings, how did you come up with such a writing, and the choice, the topic, Silence Divine, which is something that's, that really speaks to someone who lives in, how do you say it in English, in these big cities like New York and Paris?
Yeah. I mean, I think this piece kind of developed from various angles, So certainly one of the angles was my frustration with noise, right? I hope that in an essay like this, I'm not necessarily searching for there to be a dominant tone.
Uh-huh.
And I imagine some of it comes across almost as a little bit comedically frustrated by just
Yes.
the kinds of noises,
Yeah.
the motorcycles that are going to be revving, maybe
Yeah.
even today.
The Ouroboros story, my God, that's awful. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like part of it. I had listened to recording of Schopenhauer's Against Noise. So
Mhm.
I wanted to incorporate some of his insights, but also thinking to myself about what Kant might say about the noise problem, and if
Yeah.
it can be possible to come up with some kind of transcendental type of argument
Yes.
whose conclusion would be that we have a default right to silence.
Yes.
But those philosophical bits somehow work themselves into the essay. But maybe it was more of a motivation thinking about silence as this kind of state, right? I mean, it's a state of inner peace. And
Mm.
I think it's at the heart of everything that
Mm.
exists. It,
Mm.
if you dwell in it long enough, and maybe parts of the essay are not so much representing the state
Yes.
as far as they are enacting it. So I think a lot in the essay about the function of just the spaces between the paragraphs. So to
Yes.
think about
Yes.
the sense of meditative calm that
Yes.
could be present if as I'm trying to imagine the reader reading it, they're
Mm.
in a nicely isolated place, and their consciousness can, in a sense, be communing with a different consciousness.
Yes. Yes.
That's a kind of state of silence as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And you succeeded in that because I mean, reading Silence Divine, we are with you. So you, there's the voice of the narrator who is present all the time as we read, which doesn't happen that often because what interrupts reading, I have observed that for me, for example, when I'm not connecting with the piece I'm reading, my voice is dominant.
yeah, I
Yeah.
experienced the same. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like that's in fact that's part of the reason why I like going back into the classics. So like
Yeah.
when
Yes.
I reread parts of Dante,
Yes. Yes. There's a
truth and
lot of
translation.
silence in there. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So beautiful. You are also a musician. So you play the violin?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
And
yeah.
and so how does it harmonize with your rich creative life as a philosopher and a poet?
I find it to be a meditative kind of activity. So one thing I do, and I think I've kind of done this ever since the pandemic, when basically they had closed the restaurants, they closed the bars, and everything. So I would
Yeah.
just go out into nature, right? And I'd bring the violin with me. I would
Mm-hmm.
find a nice place, sometimes in the Sleeping Giant State Park.
Mm-hmm.
There's a particular boulder where I'd play from time to
Mm-hmm.
time. And it's kind of my way of unwinding and not, it's a way to not sort of, well, I don't want to present it as an escape, but sometimes I do get a little bit too worked up about a piece of writing or a certain intellectual problem,
Yes.
and I need simply to not think about it. So I'll play music, and it's been a good way to actually interact with people.
Yes.
Um, and so I feel like there's kind of structural similarities as well between various musical pieces and pieces of writing. So you can start to think about, well, what would be the equivalent of a nice dance, or like like a little song, something that's lighthearted versus something that's very, has this kind of elaborate architecture. If you
Uh-huh.
think about the
Yeah.
symphonic form, or even just a very drawn out lyrical melody,
Yeah.
right? One of my favorite composers is Prokofiev, and
Uh-huh.
you listen to the Prokofiev
Oh.
violin concertos. They just have these amazingly drawn out melodic lines where you just think, if a composer were to write that nowadays, it would just not be somehow as interesting, right? So I kind of think about that as well when in writing. What is the relationship between content and form? How should it look? When you're writing a poem, right, you pay a lot of attention to lineation.
Yes.
How do I want the reader to be perceiving this?
Yeah.
Do we have like a William Carlos Williams thing where it's just 4 or 5 words per line and then your eye just moves down the page really subtly? Or is it we're more of a wave kind of movement? So melody and line and lineation, I think, are, for me, they're connected. I remember one time I was teaching a class where I think it was an intro to philosophy class, and
Mm-hmm.
I had a student who was a violinist. She was actually very good, And she was having trouble understanding like Descartes' meditations. And I told her, well, you kind of want to think about this in the same way you might think about playing a concerto, right? So when you play a concerto, you're totally immersed in it. You're so confident that you don't need to skip over each little part of it. So you don't need to be caught up in each premise of the argument to have an understanding of it being convincing, right? At least if you try to imagine it from Descartes' own point of view, he said, well, I've rehearsed this form of argument so many, many times to myself that's what makes it evidence. That's part of what goes into the form that he used. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an underexplored form, really, like his sense of meditations.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's
Beautiful.
complicated, really, because there's also the affinities between practice and the violin, and also practice and writing, putting yourself in a different situation. Does it feel different when you go out into the woods and play versus when you're in a practice room, right? Or you're dressed up in the kind of the tuxedo or whatever in the concert. And this is something that I sometimes tell my writing students. I don't know if they take the advice, but I say, well, why not try to just write in nature, right? Why not try to come up with a soundscape, right? And to see where it leads you. See how observant, how attentive you can be just to the sounds. Focus on one sensory modality.
This is such a beautiful way of talking about philosophy and thought and how you can relate to not only a philosophical system, but something that's, because people think that philosophy is a bunch of dead ideas, but they are not. It's very much alive. And music helps a lot with that. I remember I had a teacher. So there is this program in France. I came to philosophy. I'm not a professional philosopher, but I studied philosophy a lot. And I read a lot of philosophy. And so in France, there is this program for adults, so we're already working, but who want to involve themselves more with philosophy. And usually you go study philosophy in theology departments, which is something beautiful. And you find all kinds of people there, obviously. So there's the classical philosopher who is very much into publishing or perishing, right? And there is the other one, the one who is completely absorbed in thinking and divine ideas. And I had a teacher that, so she is an Heideggerian, and Heidegger is heavy material for a lot of people. And so she would say that if you want to understand Heidegger, first of all, you need to be a mystic. And second, so you know what?
See that.
And second, you need to learn to play the piano and understand what an ostinato is. Yeah.
Yeah, the ostinato.
Yeah, and it was so, I mean, so telling, so beautiful. So for some of us who were mystics and musicians in disguise, but I mean, for the others, they go, what? What is she talking about? She's not helping. We want people to explain what is this thing, being in time and all of this. And so, yeah, I have a question for you because people struggle a lot with philosophy because it's heavy. It looks heavy material. For example, Heideggerian philosophy, German philosophy in general, can be a little daunting for the intellect. But there is also another aspect of philosophy that puts people off is the life of certain philosophers. For example, Heidegger, who kept his Nazi inclinations until the very end. But I mean, we are left with a body of philosophical work that is absolutely outstanding. So what are we supposed to do with that? There's also, do you know Althusser?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Althusser strangled his wife. So
oh wow, I did not know that.
Yeah. So we used to have those questions in class when a philosopher, a teacher, a professor would say, "Oh, you should read Althusser on that question." We go, "Yeah, okay." Most people were, but he killed his wife, so why should we listen to him? And Heidegger, yeah, he must be is
Yeah.
probably a genius, but I mean, on the Department of the Heart, not so much because his affiliation with the Nazi Party are questionable. So how can you do you have those issues in your class, first of all? And
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you
Those
handle them?
those issues do come up, and they've come up more frequently ever since we've had this kind of advent of like cancel
Yes.
culture, in America.
Yeah.
And I usually just try to remind my students of a very basic logical point, which is that a person's position is really to be separated from their character, right? I
Uh-huh.
mean, there's a way of looking at philosophy that it just consists of a set of abstract propositions arranged in a particular way that satisfy the canons of logic, or else they don't if it
Yeah.
turns out to be a bad argument. So it does seem possible, looking at it from the point of view of philosophy of language, just to come up with a strict separation between the speaker or the
Uh-huh.
philosopher in question and the propositions that they express. So in logic, we do teach the students about the whole ad hominem fallacy, that we should
Yes.
not think of that some just because somebody has a bad character that their views are necessarily wrong. Still, some students don't really appreciate the point. Cancel culture is very embedded in their
Yes.
minds, and
Yes.
so
Absolutely.
then it becomes, I think more difficult. I've had students try to say, well, why are we reading Descartes when he had this view towards animals? Descartes thought that basically animals were
Machines.
merely machines, right? And so he was
Mhm.
okay carrying out various horrid experiments on animals. And so then if they don't really appreciate the sort of logical fallacy aspect of it, I think they can also be reminded of a point that J.S. Mill makes in, I think it's one of his books, his defenses of like libertarian philosophy. So where the idea is that, well, as philosophers, but also just as like human beings, we want to have true beliefs, right? But like truth is a goal of, I think, human civilization. But even more than that, we want to have understanding. We want to have justified beliefs as well.
Yes.
And so Mill described it in terms of like being able to thoroughly know that my own position is true.
Mhm.
And in order to do that, I have to understand why the opposition's position is false, right?
Yeah.
So I have to understand exactly what mistakes they've made, right,
Yes.
and be able to move forward. So
Yes.
that that's the moving
Yes.
forward.
Yes. Very
Yeah,
efficient. Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Very effective. Yeah. Yes. And the problem is right now, I mean, people are not moving forward. They don't, of course, the understanding part is completely neglected. And that's difficult. Each time that happens, for example, I receive a lot of poetry, not now, because we we have decided to be more open about the fact that we are absolutely not for cancel culture. But I used to receive a lot of poetry that was poetry of trauma, poetry of anger, poetry of all kinds of hate,
yeah,
social
yeah.
justice and oppression. And
Right.
you go like, okay, right. So you made a point, but again, what's the point? And it's like poets have a hard time separating what's private, what's intimate, what's from the personal life from the things you can actually write about. So you can use your personal life. Of course, we all do that. You use your personal life and personal experiences to expand on a subject, but it has to remain universal and it, not awkward. It
Right.
mustn't be awkward for the
Yeah,
reader. So
I think
this is difficult. Yeah.
I think what happens with some poets, and again, this is maybe partly the fault of MFA programs to encourage students to write only from experience and in this kind of politicized confessional mode. And so
Oh,
they end up submitting to journals and thinking, well, look, poetry is basically a platform for my politics. And it doesn't, to me, that it's just, it's going to, like, they ought to maybe reflect on what makes, part of what makes a poem universal is it will survive, right? And it doesn't
Yes.
depend on having, like, imagine if some of these kind of political poems were encountered by, I don't know, a translator, some member of a future human civilization in like
Yes.
500 years. What are they going to make of it? They're going to read this and think, all right, so then I need to understand what was going on in the cancel culture movement
Uh-huh.
and
Uh-huh.
also the civil rights movement. And
Yes.
then I have to also understand like the police violence that was going on at
Yes.
that time.
Yes.
And why not just in that case read a history book instead of a
Yes.
highly historical moment that you find in a poem?
Yes. Yes.
So I I kind of think about that, think about the universality that way. But it's also, to me, I don't know, I'm not very